She had never felt so uneasy in all her days, though she wore a calm mask for the sake of her son. Catelyn Stark stood in the great hall of the twins with her back straight and her eyes scanning the shadows. The feast was intended to celebrate her brother Edmure's wedding, yet the air was thick with tension. Minstrels played a lively tune, but no one truly danced. Men drank the sour wine offered by Lord Walder Frey, but no one seemed jovial. The uneasy glances exchanged across the high tables made her skin crawl. Her instincts told her something was terribly amiss, though she could not have named exactly what. She wished desperately that Robb had not come inside these walls. Lord Walder was a tricky man, prone to grudges and resentments that spanned generations, and the insults, both real and perceived, that the king in the north had offered him through this war were plenty. Catelyn had tried to soothe the old man's pride, had done her best to help mend the slight that Robb had caused by marrying Talisa instead of a Frey daughter, but old Walder's eyes remained cold. She saw how he surveyed them all like sheep in a pen, a fox with drooping jowls and too many teeth. If she had had her way, the entire host would have camped outside while only Edmure and a small party attended the wedding. But the demands of honor and courtesy had forced their hand. Robb sat at the head table, looking more solemn than ever. The young wolf, they called him in the north, a king victorious in many battles. Yet there he was, forced to endure the biting remarks of Walder Frey as the man made crude japes about Robb's bride, about the wedding that should have been. Talisa was not present in this hall. She had been invited, of course, but had chosen to remain in quieter quarters, given her delicate condition. Catelyn did not blame her. The tension was nearly suffocating. She glanced at her brother Edmure. He was the nominal groom that day, and though he did his best to appear proud of his new bride, Rosalind Frey, Catelyn could see the subtle lines of worry around his eyes. The drums beat in the distance, echoing through the corridors, and the music in the great hall clashed strangely with that beat. It sounded almost like thunder that came from beneath the earth. Catelyn's mind wandered to the absent figure of her sworn shield, Brienne of Tarth. She had been forced to part ways with the tall, broad-shouldered woman some time ago under strained circumstances. Yet, in these last days, memories of Brienne had resurfaced in her mind as a comfort. Brienne was a warrior of unimpeachable loyalty, one who kept her oaths as devoutly as a septon clutches the seven-pointed star. If only she were here, Catelyn thought. At least I would trust that one sword unswervingly. The men surrounding her were too beholden to their own lords, their own ambitions. It made her heart ache, longing for the steadfast presence of that tall figure in shining armor. Roose Bolton sat at the table near Robb, giving away little with his pale eyes. He was a strange man, quiet, polite, yet there was something sinister about him that Catelyn had never been able to place. He seemed so calm in the midst of this gathering storm. She noticed him picking idly at the bread, lips moving in a thin line when Walder Frey spoke in that cackling voice. She did not like Roose Bolton's unnatural silence. The way his gaze roved about the hall, as though waiting for something, or someone. The hall was filled with men in Frey livery. Far too many Freys, it seemed to her. They were intermingled with Robb's bannermen, but the Northmen were fewer in number now, so many lost in battles or left to guard distant strongholds. And the knights of the Riverlands had been scattered, off fighting the remnants of Lannister forces. The mismatch was obvious. The songs the minstrels played seemed off-key, the melody dissonant. A chill slithered down her spine when Walder Frey rose from his seat, tapping a spoon on his cup to command attention. "My honored guests," he croaked. The man leered around the hall, watery eyes half concealed by his drooping lids. "We gather tonight to celebrate the union of my dear daughter Rosalind and the esteemed Edmure Tully." He gestured towards Edmure and Rosalind, and the crowd cheered politely. Edmure forced a tight smile. Rosalind kept her eyes lowered, the perfect picture of a shy bride. Walder Frey continued, "But let us not forget the many slights that have been forgiven on this most joyous day." Catelyn's stomach twisted at his words. His tone was mock-gentle, but she caught the sharp edge beneath it. "Our rightful king," he said, nodding towards Robb, "has graced us with his presence, though he broke his oath to my house. I have set that aside this day. I've set it aside for the sake of my sweet Rosalind, who is dear to me as any of my children." The old man's words droned on, but Catelyn was not listening. She was watching the crossbowmen shifting at the fringes of the hall. She was watching Roose Bolton's half-smile, the way he eased his hand beneath the table. She was watching the distant look in Robb's eyes as if he, too, sensed that the evening's ominous undertones were reaching a crescendo. Then it happened. The music changed in an instant. One moment, the minstrels were playing a lively reel. The next, the tune shifted to "The Rains of Castamere." Catelyn's heart seized. She recognized that song as if it were the Song of Doom itself. The melody spoke of Lannister triumph over House Rain, the annihilation of an entire family. And it was a grim reminder of what the Lannisters did to their enemies. Everything slowed, voices became distorted, and she heard her own pulse beating in her ears like a hammer. She saw the crossbowmen raising their weapons from the gallery. She saw Walder Frey's lips stretch into a wolfish grin. She saw Roose Bolton shift beside her son. And in that single moment, Catelyn realized that they had been lured into a trap, a betrayal so monstrous, so vile, that she nearly lost her breath. Someone screamed. One of the musicians pulled a hidden crossbow from beneath his instrument and aimed it at Robb. In an instant, blood was spilled. The Northmen and river lords around the table leapt to their feet, but they were unarmed or else had few weapons. Knives, mostly. The men who'd come to the feast had been told they would have no need of steel in the hall of a friend. How wrong they had been. Catelyn rushed towards Robb, but the tables were overturned in the chaos. Crossbow bolts whistled through the air. Men shouted. A shrill wail cut the air, and she realized with horror it was Rosalind Frey, huddling under the table as men died around her. The wedding feast was turning into a slaughter. She heard Robb's anguished cry as a bolt struck him in the shoulder. He stumbled, blood staining his tunic. Another bolt flew, grazing his side, but he remained standing, teeth bared, eyes ablaze. Roose Bolton was retreating, slipping away from the dais. Catelyn lunged forward, but a pair of Frey guards blocked her path. She grabbed a discarded dagger from the floor, slashing wildly to get through. She was no swordsman, but maternal fury guided her strikes. A guard went down, blood spraying across the rushes. Time spun around her like a hurricane of violence. Everywhere she looked, men were being cut down or shot. Some of Robb's bannermen tried to fight back with tankards, chairs, knives, anything they could lay hands on, but they were hopelessly outnumbered by the armed Freys who poured into the hall. At the high table, Walder Frey's cackle rose above the screams. "Kill them all," he commanded in a voice that quaked with malevolence. "Leave none alive to avenge themselves." And then came another voice, a shout from the corridor. The door to the side of the hall burst open. Through it stormed a towering figure in armor, fair-haired, with eyes of fierce determination. Catelyn's heart skipped as she recognized Brienne of Tarth. The warrior woman was accompanied by a handful of determined soldiers. They wore no banner she recognized, but in the swirl of carnage, that hardly mattered. The important thing was that they were fighting the Freys, cutting them down before they could reload their crossbows. Hope ignited in Catelyn's chest like a candle in a dark chamber. Brienne charged forward, her long sword in her hands, a savage cry tearing from her throat. She shattered the chaos around her with each swing of her blade, leaving Frey men bleeding in her wake. Crossbow bolts pinged off her armor, and though she flinched, she did not stop. Catelyn saw the desperation in her face, the white-knuckled determination. She'd come for her. That knowledge made Catelyn's eyes brim with tears of relief, even in that moment of horror. "Lady Stark," Brienne roared, parrying a blow from a particularly large Frey. "Get to the side door." Catelyn glanced at Robb, who was clutching his wounded shoulder. She rushed to him, dodging the bodies of the fallen. Blood slicked the floor. Robb turned his eyes to her, pain contorting his expression. "Mother," he gasped. "We have to get out." "Yes," she said, taking his arm. "Come with me." She wrapped his arm over her shoulders, supporting his weight. At that moment, a crossbow bolt streaked by, missing them by inches. A second bolt embedded itself in the table next to them with a harsh thrum. Brienne carved a path through the press of fryguards. Behind her, a soldier with a black scarf over his face slammed the butt of a spear into an attacker. Another turned to protect their flank. Catelyn would later learn how they came to be there, but in that moment, she could only feel gratitude. The chaos of the hall was deafening. Men screamed, steel clashed, fires crackled as toppled braziers spilled hot coals onto rushes soaked with wine and blood. The stench of iron and fear filled her nostrils. They pressed forward, feet slipping on the bloody floor, half-crouched to avoid the rain of crossbow bolts that came from the galleries above. Robb groaned with each step, but he kept moving. At one point, he tried to grab a fallen sword, but his injured shoulder made him cry out, and he dropped it. Catelyn gritted her teeth, supporting him as best she could. All around them, men fell. She caught a glimpse of Edmure Tully and Rosalind somewhere behind overturned tables, but her focus was on Robb. They had to live if there was any chance left for the North and the Riverlands. Brienne surged ahead, her sword a blur of lethal arcs. 3 Fry men crumpled in quick succession under her fury. She glanced back. There! She pointed to the side corridor. Go! Just then, Walder Frey's rasping voice boomed above the din. Stop them, you curs! They must not leave here alive. His eyes gleamed with a sadistic triumph that threatened to unravel Catelyn's mind. How could one man harbor such malice? Walder Frey had planned all of this with monstrous precision. Catelyn and Robb reached the side corridor. A handful of Freys attempted to block their escape, but Brienne and her small band fell upon them. Catelyn did not pause to watch, urging Robb onward. She had no idea which way to run, but anywhere was better than the Great Hall. They stumbled down a narrow passage lined with torches. Behind them, shouts and the clang of steel filled the corridors. The entire castle must be in an uproar. A few of Robb's men joined them, more by chance than design, battered and bloody but determined not to let their king die. Gritting her teeth, Catelyn led them forward, through a half-open iron door. They found themselves in a small courtyard, the night sky overhead. The sounds of distant fighting came from every direction, echoing off the stone walls. Robb nearly collapsed, but one of his men hauled him up. Smoke drifted on the wind. Somewhere, a building must have caught fire. Brienne halted, panting heavily. Her armor was dented in several places, a scratch across her cheek bleeding freely, but her eyes shone with fierce resolve. We need to get out of the twins, she said. The Freys will be hunting us. How did you? Catelyn began. There's no time, Brienne interrupted. I only knew something was wrong. I gathered what few I could find loyal to you. The rest. She shook her head. We must move now. Catelyn nodded. We have to find a way to cross the river. She remembered that the twins consisted of 2 identical keeps on either side of the Green Fork, connected by a massive stone bridge. Walder Frey controlled that crossing, the only real crossing for leagues. Boots pounded on the stones behind them. Fryguards spilled into the courtyard, weapons raised. Brienne and her companions braced, forming a line. Catelyn held onto Robb, but her heart clenched at the thought of more bloodshed. The Freys rushed forward with savage cries. Steel rang against steel as Brienne's sword met the first attacker's axe. Robb's loyal men fought at her side, though they were outnumbered. Catelyn spotted a bowman knocking an arrow near the courtyard entrance. Desperation gave her speed. She flung herself in front of Robb just as the arrow was loosed. It sailed past her harmlessly. Someone, one of Brienne's companions, brought the archer down with a spear thrust before he could shoot again. The fight churned across the courtyard. Mud and blood mingled underfoot. A horse whinnied in terror from somewhere nearby. Catelyn scanned the darkness and spotted a stable door. If they could steal a few horses, they might stand a chance of riding to safety. She clutched Robb's arm and pulled him toward the stable, ducking behind a row of barrels. One of the Fryguards spotted them and rushed forward, sword raised. He was a younger man, face twisted in fury as though he needed this kill to prove his loyalty to House Frey. Brienne saw him, but she was too entangled with two other foes to break away. Summoning what little courage she had left, Catelyn raised the dagger she still clung to. The young guard lunged, but Catelyn managed to deflect the blow, turning his blade aside with a desperate strike that jarred her arm to the shoulder. Her chest tightened in panic. She was no warrior, and it was pure luck that she had not been run through. He drew back, readying a second thrust. At that moment, Robb, wounded and staggering, intervened with a short sword he'd managed to pick up. He caught the Fry across the temple with the pommel, sending him crashing to the ground. Robb hissed in pain, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. "Mother, hurry!" he croaked. They ducked into the stable. The horses inside were already frantic, eyes rolling, hooves scraping the straw-strewn floor. Catelyn fought to calm one enough so that it would let Robb mount. Meanwhile, she heard Brienne's fierce shouts outside. The tall warrior backed into the stable entrance, trying to hold off the last of the Fry pursuers. Blood trickled into Brienne's eye from the cut on her forehead. Still, she did not waver. Another slash, another Fry man fell. Catelyn pulled Robb onto a horse. She couldn't tell which was a courser, a palfrey, or a destrier. They just needed something to ride to get out. A second horse was rearing in panic. She edged up to it, speaking softly, trying to steady it enough to mount. It sidestepped, nostrils flaring. She risked a glance at the stable doors. More men could come at any moment. Brienne turned, eyes fierce. "Go," she urged. "I'll hold them off." Catelyn's heart hammered. She didn't want to leave Brienne behind, but she knew there was no choice. She had to get Robb to safety. "Come to us when you can," she pleaded. Brienne gave a curt nod. "If the gods are good." With a heave, Catelyn swung herself onto the second horse. She clutched the reins, urging the beast forward. Robb's horse sidled close to hers. She saw him grimace, fighting to stay upright in the saddle. "Brienne," he gasped, but she had already disappeared back into the fray, her blade gleaming in the torchlight. The stable's rear exit was unguarded, likely because the Freys hadn't expected them to break out from that side. Catelyn pushed her horse into a gallop, Robb following. Her heart pounded in time with the drumming hooves. They burst into the open air, racing across a smaller yard. There was a commotion behind them, a swirl of torches and shouts, but all she could think about was escape. They encountered only minimal resistance. A lone guard stepped into their path, raising a pike. Catelyn let out a cry and jerked the reins, causing her horse to lunge aside, narrowly dodging the pike. Robb's horse crashed into the guard, toppling him. They galloped on, hooves splashing through a shallow puddle, then thundered across the drawbridge that led away from the main courtyard. They were free of the castle walls, but not yet safe. The night outside was cold, the sky moonless. The twins loomed ominously behind them, with torchlight flickering from the battlements. Alarm bells were ringing, sending a hollow clang echoing across the plains. Fry outriders would soon be on the hunt. Catelyn knew they had to put as much distance between themselves and the castle as possible. With Robb slumped in the saddle, bleeding, they raced away into the darkness. She prayed that Brienne and any other loyal friends would find their own escape, but she could not linger. Her son was gravely hurt, and the phrase repeated in her mind over and over. The phrase tried to kill us. They betrayed guest right, they betrayed all honor. The Red Wedding would go down in infamy, she knew. The North had been shattered, but they were not yet destroyed, for their king in the North still lived, and so did she. Catelyn and Robb rode through the night, guided only by the faint glimmer of distant starlight on the fields. Sometimes, she heard the howling of wolves in the distance, a reminder of the savage reality they faced. The land around the twins was mostly flat farmland, dotted with sparse groves of trees. They avoided the roads, fearful of Fry patrols. Each time they heard the distant thunder of hooves, they pulled off into the shadows, hearts hammering as they waited for the riders to pass. Robb's strength ebbed. More than once, he nearly toppled from his horse, and Catelyn had to clutch his arm or turn back to steady him. He was pale, trembling, his breathing ragged. Blood kept soaking through his makeshift bandage. They needed a maester's care, or at least a safe place to rest. At last, just before dawn, they found a small wooded copse near a shallow stream. They stopped there. Catelyn helped Robb dismount and half-carried him to a spot beneath a cluster of leaning oaks, where the ground was carpeted with pine needles. The horses stood nearby, exhausted. Robb winced as Catelyn cut away his tunic to examine the wounds. 2 crossbow bolts had struck him, one in his shoulder, one a graze along his ribs. The one in his shoulder was the true danger. Blood continued to well up around the shaft. With trembling fingers, Catelyn tried to stanch the flow, pressing cloth over it. She remembered treating small injuries for her children when they were young, scrapes and cuts, but never had she needed to deal with something this terrible. Robb clutched her wrist. "Mother, he began, but his voice was weak. "Hush," she said gently, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "Save your strength. I will do what I can." She carefully removed the broken remains of the bolt, biting back nausea at the sight of torn flesh. Robb groaned, face contorting in pain. She pressed a clean piece of cloth against the wound and whispered a prayer to the old gods, to the Seven, to anyone who would listen. She prayed for her son's life, for deliverance from this nightmare. She had never felt so alone. Daylight came slowly, pale and bleak. Robb drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish. Catelyn dared not light a fire for fear of attracting attention. She gave him sips of water, but they had no food, no medicine. Her mind wandered back to Winterfell, to a time when the biggest worries in her life were her children's quarrels or Ned being late to supper. It felt like a different world, one that might as well have never existed. At midday, she heard the noise of horses again. This time, she was certain they were caught. She crouched down, shielding Robb behind a fallen log, dagger clenched in her shaking hand. If the Freys had found them, she would fight with tooth and nail. She would not let them take her son. Then she saw who rode into view. Brienne of Tarth, her tall figure unmistakable even at a distance, though she looked as though she'd been through 7 hells. Her armor was caked with dried blood, her left arm bound in a ragged makeshift sling. Behind her rode 6 men, some wearing Tully colors, others appearing as hedge knights or sellswords. Catelyn's heart soared with relief. She rose from her hiding place. "Brienne!" At once, the tall warrior slid off her horse, almost stumbling in her own exhaustion. The men with her scanned the surroundings, wary. One of them called out, "My lady! Thank the gods we found you." Catelyn rushed to Brienne, clasping her gauntlet hand. "How did you escape?" Brienne nodded grimly. "We fought our way out of the Great Hall. Then we freed some Stark men who were locked in a cellar. We managed to make our way across the bridge. The Freys were too preoccupied with the slaughter to organize a proper pursuit until later. Some of us made it, far too many didn't." Her gaze flickered to Robb. "How is he?" "Wounded," Catelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "We need a maester." One of the men behind Brienne spoke up. He was older, with a short gray beard. "My lady, I was a field surgeon once, in the service of Lord Hoster Tully during the Greyjoy Rebellion. If I may, I can tend his wound until we get him proper care." Catelyn's voice broke with gratitude. "Yes, please." They guided Robb to a more comfortable spot near the stream. The surgeon crouched and began cleaning and bandaging his injuries with the supplies they had. Robb groaned but did not regain consciousness. Meanwhile, Brienne recounted the horror of what she had seen. The massacre in the Great Hall, the crossbows, the betrayal by the Freys and Boltons. Edmure's fate was uncertain. Some said he was taken captive. Others said he was dead. Talisa's whereabouts were unknown. Catelyn's grief was bottomless. She had felt the cruelty of the world before, losing Ned, hearing about the fall of Winterfell. But this was something new. The Red Wedding was not just a defeat. It was a monstrous crime that violated all the sacred bonds of hospitality. And yet, they were alive, at least a handful of them. The king in the north still drew breath. That meant there was still hope, though she did not know what form it would take. She thought of Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. Were they alive? Safe? She could not be sure. but she could still fight for them, for their futures. Brienne's voice shook with quiet rage. "I vow to you, my lady, that I will see Walder Frey answer for this. My life is yours to command." Catelyn squeezed her hand. "We must find a safe haven, Brienne. That is our first task. Robb's life depends on it." She looked at the ragged group of survivors. "All our lives do." They spent the remainder of the day resting in that thicket, hidden from prying eyes. The surgeon did what he could for Robb, removing the last bits of the crossbow bolt and sewing the wound. He explained that the next few days would be critical. Infection was a grave danger. If Robb could be brought somewhere with a decent healer, a maester, his chances would improve. If not, well, he trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. Catelyn could not let her son die here in the wilderness. She steeled herself. "We should head for Riverrun," she said. "My father's castle. Maybe the Freys are laying siege, but there's a chance we can slip inside." Brienne nodded, and the men agreed. Their small group would move under cover of night. They would avoid roads and villages, traveling as quickly as they could manage without causing Robb further harm. And so began their grim journey through the war-torn riverlands. As the day wore on, Catelyn prepared herself. She tore strips from her cloak to create bandages, rationed the little bread and salted meat Brienne's group had brought. In her heart burned a single desire: to keep her son alive, no matter the cost. The horrors of that night in the Twins would haunt her forever. But in those quiet hours before dusk, she could almost hear Ned's voice in her memory, telling her to be strong for their children. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, inhaled a steadying breath, and set her jaw. She was a Tully by birth, a Stark by marriage. She had lost so much, but she still had her duty, to Robb, to her family, and to the north. As night fell, they readied themselves to depart. Robb was conscious but feverish, eyes shining with pain. Catelyn stroked his hair gently as he mumbled something she could not quite hear. The meager group of survivors gathered around, checking their weapons, adjusting their gear. Their faces were grim, determined. Beyond the treeline, the war still raged, and Walder Frey would soon discover that the king in the north had slipped from his grasp. If the old man had not already realized it, it would be just a matter of time. Catelyn felt a hollow ache in her chest for the friends they had lost, for the betrayal that had shattered the alliance with the Freys. But she also felt a spark of hope, because Brienne had come, because she had not stood alone, because somehow they had survived. That hope was a fragile thing, but it was all they had left. Rising, she helped Brienne lift Robb onto his horse. He was barely able to sit upright without swaying. Two of the men steadied him on either side. Then, with a final glance over her shoulder at the dark horizon where the Twins lay, Catelyn Stark led her battered company deeper into the unknown, determined to see her son live, determined to see justice done, and determined that this betrayal would not be the end of House Stark. Night had fully fallen by the time they guided their small party away from the copse. With darkness as their shroud, they advanced slowly, mindful that Robb's injuries left him vulnerable to every bump and jostle. At times, he slumped forward in the saddle, only half aware of his surroundings. Catelyn rode beside him, reaching out to steady him whenever he wavered, her heart clenched in constant fear. Their group moved in near silence, the horses' hooves muffled by the soft ground. The only sounds were the distant croak of frogs in the marshier parts of the riverlands and the ragged breathing of the wounded. One of Brienne's men, who called himself Heron, scouted ahead, easing his horse through the brush with surprising deftness. From time to time, he would return to report on a fork in the trail or a flicker of torchlight in the distance. Each time, they took the path that led them farther from any signs of life, choosing secrecy over speed. Catelyn prayed that the Freys were not near, but a dread suspicion told her they would not be rid of them so easily. Betrayal on that scale meant they would likely hunt down any survivors with ruthless determination. Robb gave a throaty groan and sagged forward, half slipping from his saddle. Catelyn bit back a cry and caught him around the waist. "Brienne," she hissed, "we need to rest again. He can't go on like this." Brienne reined in her mount, face set in grim lines. She looked as though she'd had little rest herself. There were deep circles under her eyes, and her hand kept straying to her bandaged shoulder. Still, her voice held steady. "We'll stop for a time. Heron, see if you can find us a place to shelter." Heron nodded and spurred his horse away. The rest of the group waited in tense silence, watchful. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. The sensation reminded Catelyn of the god's wood in Winterfell, of the ancient weirwood that swayed in the breeze, its face carved with centuries of quiet wisdom. The memory made her chest tighten with longing. She had not seen Winterfell in far too long. Now she did not even know if it still stood intact, after what Theon Greyjoy had done. Heron returned and beckoned them to follow. A short ride through a tangle of bushes brought them to an abandoned farmhouse. Its roof was partially caved in, and its walls bore scorch marks from some previous skirmish. But there was enough left of the structure to provide rudimentary cover, and that was all they dared hope for. Brienne and two of the men dismounted first, clearing broken beams and scattered debris from what remained of the main room. Catelyn slid from her saddle and helped ease Robb down, trying not to jar his wounds. He let out a soft whimper, eyes fluttering. His fever had clearly worsened. Once they had him lying on a makeshift bed of blankets, the field surgeon set to work again, checking the bandages and cleaning the stitches as best he could. Catelyn hovered by Robb's side, holding his hand, pressing her palm to his clammy forehead. She felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare. Her son, the king in the north, ambushed and betrayed, on the brink of death, while she could do nothing but watch. Everything they had fought for seemed to hang in the balance. Yet, in her darkest moments, she reminded herself that he still breathed. If the gods had willed him dead, he would have perished back in that cursed hall. So long as he lived, there was hope. Outside, Brienne posted 2 men on watch while the others tended to the horses. The wind moaned through the shattered roof, carrying the scent of ash and rot. Catelyn had seen her share of war's devastation before. Fields burned, villages ransacked. But the betrayal at the Twins had a cruelty that transcended mere warfare. Walder Frey had broken sacred bonds. And Roose Bolton. She could not fathom his motives in turning against the Starks in such a brutal fashion. In her mind, she kept replaying the moment she saw him slipping away from the high table, that small, cold smile on his pale lips. In the flickering lamplight of the ruined farmhouse, she smoothed Robb's hair back from his face. "My boy," she whispered. His breathing was shallow, but he clung to life with the same stubborn will that had earned him victory in so many battles. She told herself that the young wolf would not die here, not like this. A scraping sound drew her attention. Brienne had knelt beside her, removing her gauntlets. Her expression was weary, yet resolute. "My lady, you should rest. I'll watch over him for a while." Catelyn opened her mouth to protest, but realized that fatigue weighed on her limbs like lead. She had been without sleep for far too long, and if she collapsed, she would be of little use to her son. Nodding, she gave Brienne's hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you," she murmured, "but rouse me if his condition changes." Brienne inclined her head. "I will." Though her heart was tight with worry, Catelyn allowed herself to lie down in a corner of the farmhouse, wrapping a tattered cloak around her. The broken walls let the night's chill seep in, but she barely felt it. Her mind swirled with memories. Ned's face, the children as babes, the Red Keep in King's Landing, the courtyards of Winterfell. She drifted into uneasy slumber, half dreaming of the day she had ridden south to King's Landing with that dagger in her hands, hoping to unravel the mystery of who had tried to kill Bran. So many things had happened since. She almost could not remember a time when she did not live in fear, sorrow, or both. She woke with a start sometime after midnight, jolted by a particularly bad dream. Sitting upright, she found the farmhouse dimly lit by a single lantern. Robb's rasping breaths reached her ears, and she rushed to his side. Brienne still knelt there, her tall form stiff with exhaustion, but unwavering. She had removed her breastplate and greaves, leaving her in a padded doublet stained with dirt and blood. The once proud colors of her attire were muted by darkness. "How is he?" Catelyn whispered. Brienne's eyes flickered to her. "No better, no worse. The fever hasn't broken. Catelyn pressed her palm to Rob's brow. His skin burned, yet he shivered as if cold. She swallowed. What of our sentries? So far, there's been no sign of pursuit, Brienne said. But I cannot say if that means the Freys have given up. In truth, I doubt it. Catelyn sat beside her son, stroking his hand. They will not relent until he's dead. They want the North subjugated, and Walder Frey wants to ensure no vengeance can be taken. Brienne's jaw tightened. Then we must find a way to thwart them, my lady. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. Forgive me, but I was told your brother Edmure was taken captive by the Freys. Or worse, do you believe he still lives? Catelyn closed her eyes for a moment, wrestling with the torment of uncertainty. I pray he does. The Freys may wish to keep him as a hostage to secure Riverrun's surrender. The same might be true of my nephew. Her voice caught. They may even try to ransom them to the Lannisters. Brienne's gaze burned with empathy. We should ride for Riverrun soon. If the castle is not yet taken, we may still have a chance to bolster its defense and find a maester for Robb. Agreed, Catelyn said softly. Then she lifted her eyes to Brienne. I can't thank you enough for what you did. You saved us. If you hadn't, her voice quavered, I'd be lying dead in that hall or worse. Brienne shook her head, her expression clouded with sorrow and anger. I swore an oath to protect you. The chaos at King's Landing kept me from fulfilling it earlier, but the gods gave me a chance to atone for that failure. Catelyn sensed the deep current of guilt in the woman's words. You never failed me, she said gently. You acted with honor when others did not. Brienne's lips thinned. Honor. She stared at the floor. Sometimes I wonder if honor is but a chain we lay across our own necks. Then she rose, massive and imposing. I'll take a turn outside, my lady. You stay with him. Catelyn watched her go, feeling a mix of gratitude and sorrow. She resumed her vigil by Robb's side, listening to his labored breathing, occasionally dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth from the canteen. The hours slipped by, and dawn began to glow faintly through the broken roof. They broke camp at first light. Robb was only barely conscious, but the surgeon insisted that continuing to move, if done carefully, was better than waiting for the Freys to come upon them. They rigged a litter using 2 stout branches and a length of canvas, then lashed it to one of the stronger horses. With gentle hands, they settled Robb onto it, allowing him to lie flat while they traveled. It wasn't ideal. Every jostle threatened to aggravate his wounds, but it was the best they could manage. The Riverlands had become a patchwork of scorched fields and broken villages, courtesy of the war that had raged for over a year. As they made their slow progress, they passed the charred remains of farmhouses, deserted cottages, and the occasional corpse sprawled in a ditch. Ravens circled overhead, their harsh cries echoing across the desolation. Catelyn's heart ached at the sight of such ruin in her father's lands. The Tully words were family, duty, honor, and it seemed all 3 were imperiled now. After 2 days of cautious travel, they approached a small stream near an outlying hamlet. Brienne and Heron scouted ahead. When they returned, they reported seeing no signs of Frey banners, but the settlement seemed deserted, perhaps recently so. They decided to pass it by, not wanting to risk a trap. Robb's fever had worsened, and the surgeon was running short on clean bandages and supplies. Each time Catelyn looked upon her son's pale face, she felt a dagger of fear in her belly. If they did not find a maester soon, the king in the north might not see another sunrise. That evening, they made camp in a hollow between 2 low hills. Catelyn sat by Robb while Brienne and the men prepared a small, smokeless fire to cook a bit of porridge. The soft hush of evening fell over them, broken only by the crackle of twigs and the rustle of wind. Catelyn felt a stab of nostalgia for the nights around the hearth in Winterfell, listening to the direwolf's howl beyond the walls. This war had uprooted them all, scattering the Starks across the realm like seeds in a hurricane. As she spooned a bit of water into Robb's mouth, he stirred, opening his eyes. He blinked at her, confusion clouding his gaze. "Mother," he croaked. Tears pricked her eyes. "Yes, my sweet boy. I'm here. His brow furrowed in pain. The twins. What happened? She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. We were betrayed, she said softly. Walder Frey planned a massacre at your uncle's wedding feast. We barely escaped. The memory flickered in his eyes, and he shuddered. Talisa, is she? Catelyn bit her lip. She knew next to nothing of Talisa's fate. The last she had seen of her was before the feast. I don't know, she admitted, voice trembling. She wasn't in the hall when it happened. Perhaps. She could not bring herself to say it aloud. How slim their hopes truly were. Rob's throat worked as he tried to swallow. We have to go back, we have to. Shoo, she soothed, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. We will find out what became of her. But first we must get you well. We're heading for Riverrun, if the Freys have not taken it already. His eyes fluttered closed for a moment, as though the very thought of conflict sapped what little strength he had left. He opened them again, grim determination etched on his features. We'll make them pay for this, he murmured. All of them. Catelyn's heart wrenched. She knew the thirst for vengeance that burned in her son's veins. She felt it too. Yet, they were in no position to challenge anyone so long as Rob lay in this condition. They had fewer than a dozen loyal swords with them. Still, she squeezed his hand and whispered, We will. 2 more days passed in a blur of slow travel and watchful nights. Rob drifted between fevered sleep and brief moments of lucidity. The rest of the group grew more anxious with each league. More than once, they spotted smoke on the horizon, evidence of a sacked village or an army encampment. Brienne led them in wide arcs to avoid any potential hostiles, always scouting the path ahead with Heron. Tension hung over them like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. On the 7th day after the Red Wedding, they finally glimpsed the high walls of Riverrun rising from the banks of the Red Fork. The castle stood proud, water glinting around its triangular form. For a moment, Catelyn's spirits soared to see her childhood home intact. But as they drew closer, they spotted enemy banners along the outer perimeter. Frey men, by the look of it, along with steel-clad soldiers wearing the flayed man of House Bolton. Her heart hammered in her chest. Riverrun was under siege. The gates were shut tight, the drawbridge raised. She could see no easy way in. The Frey Bolton host had set up a ring of tents and siege engines, though it did not appear they had begun a full assault. Catelyn's mouth went dry. That meant her uncle Brienne Blackfish Tully might still be holding the castle. But it also meant that any approach would be fraught with danger. They pulled back into the cover of a small wooded grove to consider their options. Brienne dismounted, her expression dark. They've come in force, she said, voice tight with frustration. We cannot simply ride in. They'd cut us down before we neared the gates. Catelyn glanced at Rob, who lay in the litter, eyes half-lidded, face gaunt. His breath rattled in his throat. There must be a way, she said, desperation creeping into her tone. My uncle is inside. He won't refuse us entry. But how do we get past the siege lines? Heron frowned. We could try crossing the river downstream and approach the castle from the water. But if they have patrols, it may be our only chance, Brienne said. In the past, Riverrun's defenders have used a postern gate that opens onto the river. If Blackfish is in command, he'll have men posted there. Catelyn weighed the risk. Even if they managed to reach that postern gate under cover of night, they would have to signal the defenders somehow. The enemy camp would likely be vigilant against any attempt to slip in. We need more information, she decided. If we can capture one of their sentries quietly, we might learn their patrol routes. Brienne nodded. I'll go tonight with Heron and a few others. We'll see if we can find a gap in their lines. She turned to look at Rob. Will he survive another night without a maester? Catelyn's gaze fell to her son's still form. He must, she whispered. She refused to consider the alternative. Each day he clung to life was a miracle. She had lost so much, Ned, Winterfell, possibly her daughters. She could not bear to lose Rob too. At dusk, Brienne led Heron and 2 others out of the grove. They took pains to mask their approach, waiting until full darkness to slip through the trees that ringed the besiegers' encampment. Catelyn remained behind with Robb, the surgeon, and the rest. Every minute crawled by, her nerves strung tight. She hovered over Robb, pressing a damp cloth to his brow, murmuring soothing words he might not even hear. Sometime after midnight, Brienne returned, her boots caked in mud, her expression grim. "They've ringed the castle thoroughly," she said. "But Heron thinks there's a spot to the north where we can cross the Red Fork. The water's lower there. We'd still have to contend with the current, but perhaps we can manage." Catelyn's stomach clenched. "And the postern gate?" Brienne nodded. "We saw signs of watchfires near the water's edge, but if we're stealthy, we might reach the gate without drawing too much attention." She paused. "We took a sentry, as you suggested." He confirmed that the main approach is well guarded, day and night. The Freys and Boltons don't expect an assault from the outside, but they're wary of anyone trying to leave the castle. "Then we attack from the outside," one of the men muttered, a wry smile on his lips. "One small band might slip through their lines more easily than an army." The plan took shape, though it felt more like a desperate gamble than a proper strategy. In the black of night, they would circle north, ford the river in a place where the current was weaker, and approach Riverrun's postern gate along the shoreline. If the defenders recognized them and opened the gate quickly, they might get inside before the Freys and Boltons could respond. If they were discovered, they would likely be overrun. But there was no choice. Robb's life depended on a maester's skill, and time was running short. They left at once under the cover of night. The horses struggled through dense brush and muddy paths, the litter jostling as they went. Catelyn's stomach was in knots each time Robb moaned in pain. She rode at his side, whispering soft words meant more to calm herself than to soothe him. She thought of her father, Lord Hoster Tully, who had been ill in Riverrun. Was he still alive, or had he succumbed to his infirmities amidst this new chaos? The questions weighed upon her soul. Near dawn, they reached the shallows. The water glimmered faintly in the starlight. Brienne dismounted, wading out to test the depth. It rose to her waist at its deepest point. A perilous crossing for a wounded man on a litter, but not impossible. With quiet determination, they prepared. They wrapped their gear to keep it as dry as possible, then led the horses into the river, guiding Robb's litter with agonizing care. The current tugged at them, threatening to unbalance both horse and man. Each step felt like an eternity as the cold water lapped at their chests. Catelyn prayed to the Seven, the old gods, any deity who might watch over them. At last, they emerged on the other side, soaked and shivering. No horns blew, no shouts of alarm. Perhaps luck was with them. They huddled among the reeds, catching their breath. Sunrise was not far off now, and they needed the cover of darkness for as long as possible. Quietly, they pressed on, leading the horses along the riverbank. The walls of Riverrun loomed ahead, silhouetted against the faint light in the east. They found the postern gate in a recessed part of the castle wall, where the Red Fork lapped against the stones. Two stout towers flanked it. A narrow footbridge spanned the water just in front of the gate, presumably retracted at present. If the defenders inside recognized them, they might lower it. If not, Catelyn refused to finish the thought. Brienne motioned for them to halt in the shadows. One of her men produced a small horn and gave a short, staccato blast, muffled by a cloth. It was a code signal, a risk, but they had no other means to announce themselves. They waited, hearts pounding. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, a torch appeared atop the wall. A voice called out, though they could not make out the words. Brienne lifted her arms, trying to show that they came in peace. Catelyn held her breath. Suddenly, a shape emerged from a sally port on the tower's base. A drawbridge of sorts, lowered with a creak. Two figures moved onto it, crossbows at the ready. Catelyn stepped forward, her hands raised. "I am Catelyn Tully Stark," she called softly, "daughter of Lord Hoster Tully. We seek refuge." There was a pause. Then one of the figures advanced a few paces. "My lady?" a voice called, tinged with disbelief. "We heard you were dead." "Not yet," Catelyn said, a tremor in her voice. "My son, the king in the north is wounded. Please, for the love of the gods, let us in." The guards hesitated. One turned his head, shouting to someone inside the gatehouse. Catelyn could not make out the words. After what felt like an eternity, a crank turned, and the narrow bridge extended over the water to connect with the bank. The crossbowmen stepped aside, though they kept their weapons pointed warily. Catelyn understood their caution. These were uncertain times. With Brienne's help, they led Robb's litter across the creaking bridge. Once inside, more guards surrounded them, torches held high. Catelyn recognized at least one face, an older guardsman who had served her father for many years. He looked at her with wide eyes, trembling slightly. "My lady," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "We thought the worst." The phrase said, "They said the Starks were slaughtered." Her chest tightened at the memory. "They slaughtered many, but some of us escaped. We need a maester at once." A younger guard nodded, gesturing urgently. "Come, this way." He turned, hurrying toward a narrow spiral staircase that led up into the castle's interior. Catelyn and Brienne followed, guiding Robb's litter with what care they could manage. The men around them parted like a tide, shock evident on their faces. They emerged into a corridor lit by wall sconces. The stone walls bore the familiar tapestries of House Tully, fish embroidered on a field of red and blue. Catelyn felt a wave of emotion at the sight. She had grown up here. Now it felt like she was stepping into a memory come to life. But there was no time for nostalgia. Robb let out a low moan, and she knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his clammy cheek. "Hold on," she murmured. Footsteps rushed toward them. A maester in gray robes, flanked by a pair of anxious-looking attendants. "My lady," he said breathlessly, bowing his head. "We heard rumors, but never dared hope. Quickly, bring him to the infirmary." They lifted Robb onto a stretcher and hurried him away, leaving Catelyn, Brienne, and their ragged companions standing in the corridor. Tears pricked Catelyn's eyes as relief, fear, and exhaustion warred within her. "Thank the gods," she whispered, scarcely able to believe they had come this far. One of the older knights approached, his eyes solemn. "My lady, Lord Hoster, he passed not long ago. The castle is under the command of the Blackfish now. He will want to see you at once." The news of her father's death hit Catelyn like a blow, though she had expected it for some time. Still, she bowed her head, grief and relief mingling in her chest. "Yes," she said softly. "Take me to my uncle." Brienne and the others followed as the knight led them through corridors that twisted around the castle's interior. Finally, they arrived at a guarded door. Inside, seated at a table covered with maps and dispatches, was Ser Brinden Tully, the Blackfish. His face was lined with worry, and his hair had grown more silver than she remembered. But the steel in his eyes had not faded. He rose to his feet the moment he saw her. "Cat," he breathed, crossing the space in a few strides. He enveloped her in a fierce embrace that smelled of sweat and leather. "By the gods, I thought you were lost." She clung to him, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I nearly was," she whispered. "Uncle, there is so much to tell you." The Blackfish's gaze flicked to Brienne, and then to the handful of men behind her. "You're all welcome here," he said, "though as you can see, we have our troubles." He gestured to the maps, showing the ring of siege lines around Riverrun. "Those treacherous Freys and Boltons have demanded our surrender. They claim King Robb is dead, that the Red Wedding ended the Stark threat once and for all." Catelyn gritted her teeth. "They're wrong. Robb lives. He's grievously wounded, but I managed to bring him here." She took a shaky breath. "If we can nurse him back to health, if we can rally whatever allies remain." The Blackfish raised a hand gently to forestall her. "We'll do all we can, but be warned. The Riverlands are a wasteland, and the North is in turmoil. Our foes are many, and the Lannisters still hold the Iron Throne. We must proceed carefully." Catelyn lifted her chin, determination burning through her weariness. "We will not bow to these butchers. Walder Frye, Roose Bolton. They have shown us what we can expect if we yield. We must hold Riverrun, gather our strength, and strike back. For the North, for the Riverlands, for all who were wronged at that wedding." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, let us stand together." It's time the red wedding found its answer. In the flickering lantern light, Catelyn felt the stirrings of a grim resolve. The world had turned dark and treacherous, but they had not been snuffed out. Robb still drew breath. The Stark cause still smoldered like a spark in a field of ashes. One day soon, she vowed, they would set that field aflame in righteous vengeance. The Freys and Boltons would learn that some bonds, once broken, could unleash a fury far greater than they had ever imagined. In the days that followed her reunion with Ser Brienne Tully, Catelyn Stark felt as though she lived in two worlds at once. The quiet, torchlit corridors of Riverrun, and the violent, perilous realm beyond its walls. While the castle's gates remained barred against the enemy, she and her companions carried the weight of distant hopes and pressing fears alike. Robb lay within the infirmary, fighting off fever and infection. Each time she entered that chamber with the maester's permission, her heart clenched at the sight of how pale and still he looked. The surgeons and attendants changed his bandages regularly, muttering about how close the bolts had come to piercing his lung, how much blood he had lost, how the fever seemed reluctant to subside. Yet, Catelyn noted that some vestige of strength still flickered behind her son's eyes whenever he managed to rouse from his half-sleep. That glimmer kept her going. Each day, she would press his hand and murmur encouragement. Some days he nodded faintly, too weak to speak. On others, he whispered questions about his bannermen, Talisa, and their next move against the Freys. Though she did not always have answers to give him, she offered what reassurances she could. Brienne was everywhere at once, a tireless sentinel despite her own injuries. She posted herself outside the infirmary door whenever she was not on the battlements with the Blackfish, surveying the siege lines through a spyglass. Tall and imposing in her worn armor, the Maid of Tarth attracted stares from the Tully men, who whispered of her valor in saving Catelyn and Robb at the Twins. Word of that exploit had spread quickly through the castle. Some men hailed Brienne as a knight in all but name. Others muttered that a woman had no place bearing steel. Brienne seemed unmoved by either praise or scorn, focusing instead on her sworn duty. If Catelyn chanced upon her in a corridor, the tall warrior would bow her head respectfully and inquire after Robb's condition. And each time, Catelyn felt a surge of quiet gratitude. This woman, who had once been scorned for her loyalty to Renly Baratheon, had thrown herself into the path of crossbow bolts to save them all. Without her, there would be no king in the north to tend, no chance of vengeance, no hope. Ser Brienne Tully, her uncle, the Blackfish, devoted every waking moment to reinforcing Riverrun's defenses and gauging the strength of their foes. Catelyn saw him rarely, for he was always on the battlements or in war councils with the castle's captains. Each time she did manage to speak with him, he would shake his head grimly. Their enemies numbered in the thousands, with Frey banners spread thick as locusts in every direction, bolstered by companies of Bolton men who wore the flayed man's sigil on their surcoats. It was a union forged of treachery, one that turned Catelyn's stomach. She could not fathom how a Northman like Roose Bolton could side with Walder Frye and the Lannisters. But the world had become a place where honor counted for little and alliances shifted in the shadows. Here, behind Riverrun's thick walls and the shining waters of its moat, they clung to the last scraps of what the Starks and Tullis once stood for. On the fourth day after their arrival, the Maester granted Robb short visits from his mother, so long as she did not tire him. His fever had broken the previous night, leaving him pale and shaky but marginally improved. Catelyn entered the infirmary, heart pounding in her chest, to find him propped up slightly on a pillow, his eyes open. Though still clouded by pain, his gaze brightened when he saw her. The bandages on his shoulder and ribs had been changed that morning, and traces of fresh herbs lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of boiled water and candle wax. She went to his side and brushed a hand over his brow. "How do you feel?" she asked, voice gentle. Robb's lips quirked in a faint, humorless smile. "Better than when we fled the twins, mother." His words were soft but clear. "Maester says I'll mend, though I'll not be brandishing a sword anytime soon." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "That is more than I dared hope. We were so close to losing you." She swallowed, remembering how limp he had been in the saddle, how his blood had soaked her hands. "The gods are merciful." He shifted slightly, wincing. "Merciful," he echoed, his tone bitter. "I keep thinking of our men who died in that hall. Men who had followed me through every battle, who trusted we would be safe under guest right." A flicker of rage hardened his expression. "What Walder Frey did, cannot let it stand. As soon as I can sit a horse." Catelyn pressed her hand against his good arm. "Hush, we will have our reckoning with Walder Frey, but not until you are stronger. I do not want to lose you, Robb. We have so few allies left." He nodded, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "I know. It just burns me to lie here, helpless." She gave him a sad smile. "We can still fight him in other ways. Your uncle and Brienne are holding the castle. I doubt Walder Frey can mount an assault swiftly. From what I've seen, they're content to starve us out." The thought of a siege, prolonged and brutal, made her insides clench. "But Riverrun's walls are strong, and the Blackfish is a seasoned commander." Robb stared at the ceiling for a moment, grim lines etched at the corners of his mouth. "They won't just sit idle forever. They need to prove to the Iron Throne that the Red Wedding ended the Stark Rebellion. If they can't display my head, they'll try to force the castle's surrender by any means." She covered his hand with hers. "Let them try. As long as we can hold out, we have a chance. Northmen remain loyal to you in their hearts, if not in open defiance of the Boltons." She exhaled. "And there may yet be lords of the Riverlands who will come to our aid, if we can get word to them." He shut his eyes briefly, as though warding off a wave of dizziness. "We will find a way," he murmured. "We must." That evening, Catelyn joined the Blackfish in the solar that had once belonged to her father. The chamber overlooked the Red Fork, with narrow windows that admitted the gentle murmur of water against the castle's walls. The memory of her childhood rushed in on her, unbidden. She used to read by those windows, soaking in the warmth of the sun. Now, the sky out there glowed with the ruddy light of watchfires, a sign of the besiegers' presence. She saw the reflection of flames dancing on the dark river below. Her uncle stood hunched over a map spread across the table, frowning. His silver hair glinted in the lantern light. "Cat, come see this," he said, beckoning her forward. He pointed to neat little drawings that represented the Frey encampments. "From what our scouts say, they've entrenched themselves along this road here and here, cutting off any approach to Riverrun. The Bolton men are stationed closer to the western side, forming a second cordon." She studied the marks. "They mean to strangle the castle slowly." Her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears. "Precisely. They know a direct assault would cost them dear. Riverrun's defenses are formidable, especially with us controlling the portcullis and the river gate. But if they starve us of supplies, force us to ration, eventually they can strike when we're too weak to resist." His gaze flicked to her face. "We have enough stores for a decent stretch of time, several months in fact, but not indefinitely." She drew her arms around herself. "Is there any chance the Freys will attempt negotiations first? Walder Frey might want to avoid a protracted conflict if he can secure Edmure's compliance. If they truly have Edmure hostage," the Blackfish's mouth pressed into a thin line. "They likely do. They want to use him to demand we open the gates without a fight. But I won't yield Riverrun to those filth. We must think of a way to break the siege or to hold it long enough that a shift elsewhere forces the Freys to withdraw." He sighed. "Perhaps something in the north, or a blow from another quarter. Do you think the Vale would intervene? Your sister, Lady Lisa." Catelyn felt a stab of hopelessness. "Lisa is unpredictable. She's sealed herself behind the Ares defenses for fear of Lannister retribution. I do not think she will risk war to aid us." She hesitated, Stannis Baratheon is rumored to be fighting in the north against the wildlings or forging an alliance at the Wall, but that's half a realm away, and he'd have no reason to come south to help House Tully. The Blackfish's expression grew darker. Then we rely on ourselves. If we can smuggle messages to the last loyal Riverlords, House Mallister perhaps, or the remnants of House Derry, maybe they can harass the Freys from behind. Little raids, burning their supply lines. If that can create a gap, we might slip Robb out of here, or muster enough men for a sally. She nodded. We must. My son's life depends on it. The North depends on it. But so do you, Uncle. Riverrun is the last bastion of our house. If it falls, he placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. We will make a stand worthy of the name Tully, whatever comes. Then he paused. Has Robb stirred? He has, and he speaks of revenge, but I fear his heartbreak is as bad as his wounds. He still does not know what befell Talisa after the slaughter. The Blackfish's eyes softened. I'm sorry, Cat. I remember how you and Ned faced your own trials. This realm seems determined to take from us all that we hold dear. But so long as Robb lives, the North has a leader. We'll keep him safe. She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. Yes, we must. They parted ways soon after, the Blackfish returning to his map while Catelyn walked the torchlit corridors back to the infirmary. Brienne joined her en route, towering and silent as a sentinel, and together they climbed the spiral staircase. The clang of boots and distant shouts from the courtyard reminded Catelyn that the castle was at war. Those inside seldom slept more than a few hours at a time. Every man and woman was needed to keep watch or to manage supplies, from the lowliest scullion to the highest knight. If the Freys tested the walls in the night, they had to be ready. When Catelyn arrived at the infirmary, she found the maester adjusting a lamp beside Robb's pallet. He looked up and bowed his head. My lady, the king has taken a sleeping draught, so I expect him to rest more soundly tonight. Catelyn bent over Robb's form, relief mingling with maternal worry. His breathing was steady, and the lines of pain around his mouth had eased slightly. Thank you, she said softly. Will he wake in the morning? I believe so, yes, but do not be alarmed if he remains drowsy. Healing from such injuries requires a great deal of energy. She brushed her knuckles lightly across Robb's cheek. You've done so much for him. I'm in your debt. The maester waved off her thanks. My duty is to serve this castle and its lords. The Tullys have always been kind to us in return. Brienne lingered by the doorway, watchful. When Catelyn turned away from the bed, she heard the warrior's voice, low and determined. My lady, if there is nothing further I can do here, I will take my turn on the ramparts. Catelyn studied her, noting the lines of weariness that darkened Brienne's eyes, the stiffness in her bound arm. You need rest too, she said gently. Brienne's mouth tightened. I cannot sleep, not well. Each time I close my eyes, I see that cursed hall again. The crossbows, the screams. Catelyn understood all too well. She herself was haunted by flashbacks of that night. Then do what you must, but promise me that if your wounds trouble you, you'll see the maester. The tall woman bowed her head. I promise. With that, she turned on her heel and slipped out into the corridor, her boots echoing in the hush. Catelyn watched her go, then sank onto a stool beside Robb's pallet. For a time, she sat in silence, simply listening to her son breathe. Eventually, her own eyes grew heavy, and she let herself drift into an uneasy doze. Morning brought a new tension to Riverrun. Word passed through the ranks of guards that Frey outriders had been spotted beyond the western fields, possibly preparing to shift their encampment. On the battlements, archers drilled in crisp lines while the Blackfish supervised. Catelyn made her way up there, stepping out onto the walkway along the castle wall. The sunlight gleamed on the red fork, a welcome sight after so many nights of flickering torchlight. She took a moment to inhale the brisk morning air. The stone battlements were cool beneath her palms, worn smooth by the touch of generations of Tully defenders. She found her uncle peering through a spyglass at something near the horizon. Look there, he murmured, handing her the glass. Following his gesture, she aimed it at the plain to the west, where lines of tents and pavilions sprawled across the landscape like a patchwork. She saw the silver gray of Fry banners alongside the pale pink of Bolton's flayed man. Riders in those heraldries converged near a group of wagons. As she focused, she caught sight of a figure in dark armor that shimmered slightly under the morning sun. "Roose Bolton?" she asked, lowering the glass. The Blackfish inclined his head. "Could be. Or one of his officers. They're up to something, reorganizing their lines. More men have arrived in the night, unless my eyes deceive me. It seems the Boltons are sending fresh forces to bolster the siege." Catelyn's stomach twisted. "They mean to tighten the noose. Gods, will they never relent?" A shadow fell across them. Brienne had appeared, bowing her head in greeting. "My lord, my lady." The men on the North Tower report increased patrols circling the perimeter. They worry the Freys might attempt a feint or a small raid to test our strength. The Blackfish grimaced. "They may. I'll have the men stand ready. Let them come. We'll repel them from our walls." Catelyn returned the spyglass to him. "My uncle, do we still have any means to send word beyond the siege lines? Ravens, perhaps?" He sighed. "We do have ravens, but the Freys and Boltons have likely placed watchers around, day and night, to spot any bird leaving our rookery. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but the chances of success are slim." His eyes flicked to Brienne. "Unless, of course, we consider a more daring approach on foot. Someone sneaking out under cover of darkness." Brienne's gaze sharpened. "I would volunteer, my lord, but I won't abandon Lady Catelyn unless she commands it." Catelyn felt a pang of gratitude. "Brienne, I need you here, but perhaps we can find someone else who knows these lands intimately. Harren has scouted for us before. If we can slip a small team across the river or through the water gate at night, maybe they can carry messages to any loyal houses still unaligned." The Blackfish drummed his fingers on the stone merlin. "It's dangerous. If they're caught, they'll be strung up as spies. But it may be our only chance. I'll speak with Harren tonight." Before they could continue, a sudden horn blast boomed from the fields below. 3 short notes that echoed off the castle walls. Catelyn's heart jolted. She peered over the battlements, spotting a single rider approaching on a gray horse, carrying a white pennant. The rider came to a halt well within range of Riverrun's archers, holding the flag high. "They want parley," the Blackfish muttered. He glanced at Catelyn. "Likely they bring demands for our surrender or news of Edmure. Will you come with me to hear them out?" She swallowed, steeling herself. "Yes, we must learn what they intend, at least." Brienne and a dozen guards accompanied them to the drawbridge that spanned Riverrun's moat. The gates remained closed, but through a small sally port, the Blackfish stepped forward to address the rider. Men on the walls watched, crossbows trained on the figure below. Catelyn stood slightly behind her uncle, chin raised, heart pounding with anger and dread in equal measure. The rider wore the colors of House Fry, a blue and gray surcoat, the twin towers embroidered on the chest. He lifted his visor, revealing a face pinched with nervous tension. He looked young, perhaps no older than 20. "My lords of Riverrun," he called, voice wavering a bit. "I come bearing words from Lord Walder Fry and Lord Roose Bolton. They entreat you to open your gates and deliver up Catelyn Stark, the pretender King Robb Stark, and any who continue to rebel against the Iron Throne. In exchange, they promise mercy for the castle garrison and clemency for Ser Brinden Tully." Catelyn's hands clenched into fists. The nerve of them, to demand she and Robb be handed over like cattle. The Blackfish's voice rang out, cold as steel. "Tell your masters that Brinden Tully does not parley with oathbreakers who murder guests beneath their own roof." The young Fry cleared his throat. "Lord Walder says that Edmure Tully is in his care. If you refuse, Edmure's life is forfeit, and House Tully will end with him. Riverrun is surrounded. You cannot hold out forever. My lord offers you all a chance to avoid needless bloodshed. Surrender, and the terms will be more generous than you deserve." Catelyn's anger flared, but it was tinged with dread. Edmure was indeed their hostage. She could almost hear Walder Frey's cackle in this messenger's voice. She stepped forward, ignoring Brienne's cautioning hand. "I am Lady Catelyn Tully Stark," she said, voice resonating. "You speak of mercy, yet your master butchered my family at a wedding feast. We know what Fry mercy looks like." The rider's face twitched with something close to shame or fear, but he pressed on. "My lady, I only bear the words of those who command me. If you will not yield, then House Fry and House Bolton must do their duty to the realm. King Joffrey Baratheon has named Lord Roose Bolton Warden of the North, and all who defy him are traitors." A bitter laugh bubbled up from Catelyn's throat. "King Joffrey," she repeated, her tone laden with contempt. "The boy who had my husband executed on false charges. Spare me your talk of rightful kings." The Blackfish stepped sideways, planting a hand on her shoulder before she could speak further. His gaze, however, remained fixed on the Fry messenger. "You have delivered your message. Now hear mine. Riverrun stands under the rightful leadership of House Tully, loyal to King Robb Stark. We do not acknowledge the so-called authority of oathbreakers and murderers. If Edmure yet lives, you tell Walder Fry he had best treat him well, for there will be no surrender, and if he harms our lord, our vengeance shall know no bounds. Now ride away before my archers lose patience." The young man paled. He lowered his visor, reined back his horse, and galloped off. The horns sounded again, and a faint cheer rose from the Fry lines, mocking in its timbre. The Blackfish exhaled, his breath hissing through clenched teeth. "They'll attempt something soon," he said quietly. "They won't let us rot here in peace." Catelyn turned aside, hugging herself. She could almost feel Edmure's presence, remembering how he had teased her as a girl, how he had once fallen off his pony trying to impress the stable girl. Now his fate hung on Walder Frey's whims. She prayed, silently and fervently, that her brother's life would be spared long enough for them to find a way out of this siege. She glanced at Brienne, whose face was set in a mask of quiet outrage. Even from behind the tall warrior, Catelyn sensed the tension in every muscle. They returned to the courtyard, where the garrison waited for news. The Blackfish spoke simply. "They demand our surrender and threaten Edmure's life." A growl of anger rippled through the men. He raised a hand. "Hold your tempers. We do not yield to murderers. Return to your posts. Be vigilant." Catelyn withdrew to the great hall, her mind churning. The threat to Edmure hung over her like a storm cloud. If she could only bargain for him, but that would mean turning over Robb or leaving him unprotected. It was impossible. She felt a surge of guilt at the thought of her brother in chains. Yet the more pressing duty lay with her wounded son, the king in the north. If Walder Fry had demanded only her, she might have gone. But Robb needed her, and his cause was crucial to any future they might have. She paced the great hall, which stood mostly empty save for a few guards and a scattering of furniture. Once this place had been filled with banners and laughter, a seat of Tully hospitality. Now it seemed a cavern of echoes and worry. Eventually, she could bear it no longer and went to check on Robb again. He was awake, propped against pillows, though a sheen of sweat glistened on his brow. The maester hovered beside him, fussing with a mixture of herbs. When he saw Catelyn, Robb's face tightened with a question. "Mother, what's happened?" he asked, voice hoarse. She sat beside him. "They sent a messenger under a flag of truce," she said quietly, "demanding we surrender. They hold Edmure hostage. If we refuse..." Robb's good hand balled into a fist. "How many more cruelties do they mean to heap upon us?" His breath caught, and he broke into a spasm of coughs. The maester hurried forward with a cup of water. Robb sipped, closing his eyes for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "We cannot yield, mother." She nodded, placing a hand over his. "We will not. But Edmure..." A tremor passed through Robb's features. "He knew the risks," he whispered. "If we had not gone to that wedding, we might have saved him. But we didn't know Walder Frey's villainy ran so deep." He drew in a shaky breath. "I cannot trade the entire North's cause for one life, even Edmure's." It pained her to hear the finality in his tone, yet she understood. Ned had once told her that a lord must keep his people's welfare foremost, no matter the personal cost. Robb was learning that lesson in the harshest way. She squeezed his fingers gently. "Get well, my son. We will need you strong if we are to break this siege and save whoever we can." Days blurred into nights. The Freys began sporadic tests of the castle defenses. Small groups creeping to the walls, firing a few arrows to gauge the strength of Riverrun's watchmen. Each attempt was repelled swiftly, the defenders raining bolts down on the attackers. No major assault came yet, but tension rose with each passing hour. From the ramparts, Catelyn often saw wagons arriving at the enemy camp, presumably bearing supplies or additional men. She spied the pink flayed man banner more often now, a hateful reminder that House Bolton had betrayed them all. To distract herself from the crushing worry, she assisted the maesters in the infirmary, bringing water and cloth for the wounded. A handful of men had been injured in these minor skirmishes on the walls. None were grievously hurt, but the potential for a larger battle loomed. Robb's condition improved gradually. Though he could not yet stand unaided, he found the strength to take a few steps around his bedchamber, leaning on Catelyn's shoulder. His frustration at his own weakness was palpable, but each day that he survived was a small victory. Brienne remained unwavering. She spent her hours drilling with Riverrun's knights, giving them pointers on swordsmanship, or standing guard over Robb's chamber if Catelyn had to attend to other matters. Some men were skeptical of taking instruction from a woman, but her skill with a blade soon silenced most objections. More than once, Catelyn observed from the sidelines as Brienne disarmed a younger knight with a dispassionate efficiency that left him red-faced and astonished. Late one afternoon, Catelyn found Brienne alone in a side courtyard, practicing forms with her long sword. The warrior's injured arm still showed signs of strain, but she grimly continued through her drills, sweat darkening her tunic. Catelyn watched her for a moment, admiring the fluidity of her movements. She thought of her own daughters, Sansa and Arya, wishing they had had a chance to learn such strength on their own terms. But that was not the path the world had set for them. Arya might have loved to wield a sword as Brienne did, though Catelyn could not banish the worry that her younger daughter was lost somewhere in the war-torn countryside. She approached quietly. "Brienne," she said in a low voice, "you've been at this all morning. You should rest." Brienne lowered her blade, catching her breath. "I cannot idle, my lady. My skill must remain honed if I am to protect you and your son." She frowned. "You need me for more than that, though, don't you?" Catelyn paused, considering. "I do. There may come a time soon when I must dispatch a small party to seek aid or sabotage the Frey lines. My uncle hopes Harren can lead such a mission, but you are the most skilled fighter we have." She looked at the woman who had saved her life once before. "And you've already proven yourself brave beyond measure." Brienne studied her blade, then slid it back into its scabbard. "If that time comes, I'll do as you command." Catelyn nodded. "Thank you, but for now, rest. You'll do no good if you collapse from exhaustion." Reluctantly, Brienne relented and followed her to the castle interior. A heavy silence lay over the corridors, as if every stone was bracing for the violence that threatened to erupt. That night, the horns sounded again from the Frey camp, but there was no messenger, no parley. Only a grim serenade of drums that beat for an hour, then fell silent. Catelyn imagined it was Walder Frey's cruel way of reminding them that time was on his side. On the 7th day of the siege, Riverrun's watchers on the North Tower reported a disturbance at dawn. A large force of Bolton men had moved away from the west, circling northward as though they intended to cross the Red Fork upstream. The Blackfish hurried to the walls, commanding the archers to stand ready. Catelyn joined him, scanning the horizon. Through the morning haze, they saw dust rising from a column of riders in the distance. The Bolton banner flapped above them. "They're not attacking the walls," said one of the knights, confusion in his voice. "They're heading away, as if to range beyond the castle." The Blackfish's brow furrowed. "Could be a feint, or they might be scouting for other crossing points. They might fear reinforcements for us from that direction." He turned to Catelyn. "Perhaps they suspect we've summoned aid." She clutched the stone parapet. If they move too far, that might open a gap in the siege lines near the west road. But we can't be sure. Could be a trap. The morning passed with no clear answer. The Bolton riders remained out of sight beyond a line of low hills. Frey outriders still circled the rest of the perimeter. The lull frayed everyone's nerves. Riverrun's defenders half expected an assault to strike from the opposite side, but none came. By noon, a scout returned to the castle through a secret water route, nearly discovered by the Freys. Soaked and shivering, he reported that he had seen Bolton men capturing peasants in nearby villages, dragging them south with wagons loaded with provisions. They're tightening control over the surrounding lands, he said, breath hitching. No one is permitted to travel without a Bolton or Frey escort. They're shipping grain to their camp, ensuring we can't get any from the local folk. The Blackfish cursed under his breath. They're stripping the countryside. We must send word to the scattered farmers to hide their stores or flee. Though how we can get them warning in time, he trailed off, grimacing. We have so few men to spare for these tasks. It was that afternoon that the first genuine blow of the siege fell. From the parapets, Catelyn watched as a large band of Frey infantry massed on the eastern side of the castle. Trumpets blared, and a squadron of crossbowmen advanced behind makeshift mantlets, big wooden shields on wheels meant to protect them from arrow fire. The men of Riverrun roused at once. Archers hurried to their stations, quivers stuffed with arrows, and the Blackfish strode along the ramparts, shouting encouragement. Catelyn felt her pulse quicken. Brienne was by her side, sword drawn. The entire fortress seemed to vibrate with the tension of looming battle. Frey men began loosing bolts at the walls, a thrum of bowstrings that made Catelyn's heart pound. But Riverrun's defenders were ready. They rained arrows down on the attackers, and a few men pitched forward with bolts embedded in their torsos. The Freys tried to push forward, seeking cover behind their mantlets, but the defenders' superior vantage inflicted heavy casualties. After a quarter hour of fierce exchange, the Freys withdrew, dragging their wounded. A ragged cheer went up from the ramparts. Yet Catelyn noticed that the Freys had not brought their full strength. This had only been a probing attack. In the aftermath, the Blackfish surveyed the damage. No real harm to our walls, he reported, face taut. They wanted to see how many archers we'd commit. He glanced around at the men, some of whom were nursing minor scratches or bruises from near misses. They'll come again, likely in greater force. Sure enough, a second assault came just before dusk. This time, the Freys brought a battering ram, though how they intended to use it against Riverrun's raised drawbridge was unclear. The defenders lit braziers of pitch and hurled flaming arrows into the ranks below. The ram caught fire quickly, turning into a rolling blaze that forced its handlers to abandon it. Shouts of pain and fear rose below. Once again, the Freys pulled back, leaving smoldering wreckage in front of the moat. Catelyn's chest tightened with dread as she realized these were but the first maneuvers in what could become a lengthy siege, with wave after wave of assault. And all the while, the enemy would keep tightening their grip on the surrounding lands, ensuring that no relief could come easily. She descended from the walls at nightfall, shoulders aching with tension. In the great hall, a hurried meal was served. Boiled grain, a bit of salted fish, hard bread. Rations were already showing the strain, and the stewards urged everyone to eat sparingly. As she tried to swallow the bland fare, Catelyn's thoughts drifted to Edmure once again, picturing him in chains, fed only at Walder Frey's whim. The vow to stand firm for the sake of the North and for Robb Ward with her love for her brother. The next morning brought a brief respite, but on the second day, the Freys tried yet another angle, sending men to the southern side of Riverrun with small skiffs, apparently intending to cross the moat or sabotage the water gate. They were met by a hail of arrows from the Blackfish's bowmen stationed on the walls, and the effort collapsed before it truly began. Watching from the battlements, Catelyn felt a grim satisfaction at seeing the enemy thwarted once more, though the cost in arrows and the vigilance required took a toll on the defenders. Every day demanded more men at every post. Exhaustion crept in and injuries mounted. Horses, checking tack, murmuring in low voices. Brienne stood with Robb, adjusting the straps of her own armor. The tall warrior had insisted on wearing a steel breastplate, even though her shoulder still ached. "It's no worse than what your grace has endured," she said firmly when Robb cautioned her. Near sunset, the watchers on the walls kept an eye to the north. Finally, they glimpsed a small plume of black smoke rising just beyond the fry lines, near the area Slater had indicated. Within minutes, horns sounded in the enemy camp. Armed men scrambled, and a group of fry soldiers began marching in that direction to meet the threat. The watchers relayed the news down to the courtyard. Robb, astride a chestnut gelding, turned to the Blackfish and Catelyn, who stood by. His face was tight with pain but resolute. "This is it," he said. "I'll return before the hour is out, if the gods favor us." Catelyn could barely speak past the lump in her throat. She managed a nod. Brienne mounted her own steed, placing herself on Robb's left flank. A dozen knights in stark livery, what was left of that proud host, formed around them, along with a handful of Riverrun's riders. Another 20 archers and foot soldiers waited inside, ready to follow once the gate lowered. The Blackfish thrust a hand forward. "Open the gates. Let the king pass." With a groan of chains, the portcullis rose, and the drawbridge slowly lowered over the moat. The warhorses stamped, eager to charge. Robb cast one last glance at his mother, then kicked his mount forward. The small but determined force thundered out of Riverrun, hooves drumming on the wooden bridge. They swept across the field, aiming for a cluster of fry tents near the eastern lines where siege engines were stored. Already, the defenders on the walls loosed arrows to cover them, striking down some of the confused fry soldiers who turned to face this sudden sortie. Catelyn watched from the battlements, her heart in her throat. She could see Robb's form among the riders, moving slower than he might have if fully healthy, but still pressing on. Brienne rode close, her sword raised. Chaos erupted in the enemy camp, men shouting and scattering as the knights crashed into their lines. A catapult half assembled on the plain went up in flames as one of Robb's archers loosed a flaming arrow into its winch mechanism. Another group of defenders tried to rally, only to be blindsided by more burning missiles from Riverrun's ramparts. For a moment, it seemed the plan might succeed beyond their hopes. Shouts rose in the distance, and the watchers glimpsed a second plume of smoke to the north. No doubt Slater's men continuing their raid. The Freys were caught between two fronts, struggling to organize. But the small size of Robb's company meant they risked being overwhelmed quickly once the Freys regrouped. Catelyn's nails dug into the battlement stone as she saw a fresh wave of fry footmen pouring in from the south, brandishing spears. The riders were forced to circle around the burning catapult to avoid being flanked. She spotted Brienne's armor flashing in the firelight, her long sword cutting down a spearman who lunged at Robb's horse. Robb himself clutched the reins, apparently unable to use his right arm effectively, though he swung a small shield with his left to ward off another blow. It was a desperate melee. The swirl of steel, flames, and dust made it hard to see who struck whom. For an agonizing moment, Catelyn lost sight of her son entirely, only to spot him again when Brienne's horse reared, lashing out at a fry soldier who tried to drag Robb from the saddle. The watchers on the walls seized every opportunity to shoot at fry soldiers who separated from the melee, but they had to be careful not to strike their own men. Shouts carried across the field, "Stark! Tully! Death to the Freys!" The push and pull of battle seemed locked in a savage dance. Then, gradually, the horns of the fry camp began to blow, summoning more men. Catelyn's breath caught. They would soon be hopelessly outnumbered. She gripped the Blackfish's arm. "We must signal them to return." He barked an order down to the gatehouse. A trumpet gave 3 sharp blasts, the agreed signal to withdraw. The riders around Robb heard it, for Catelyn saw them wheel their horses around, trying to break free from the knot of fry footmen. Another volley of arrows from the walls helped scatter the enemy ranks just enough for a gap to appear. One by one, the knights peeled away, streaming back toward Riverrun with the wounded or unhorsed men clinging to saddles. Brienne emerged from the fray, blood on her sword, her helmet dented. Robb rode beside her, half slumped in the saddle, his face drawn with pain. The watchers cheered at the sight of them still alive, but the danger was not over. Fry crossbowmen had taken up positions near a small rise, loosing bolts at the retreating riders. Several men cried out and fell. Brienne raised her shield, though it was battered and barely intact. Robb ducked his head as a bolt whizzed by. Another struck a knight's horse in the flank, toppling beast and rider. 2-foot soldiers dashed forward to drag the man to safety. By then, they were close enough to the gates that the archers on the walls returned fire. Some crossbowmen went down, buying precious seconds for the battered Starks and Tullis to cross the drawbridge. Catelyn ran down from the battlements to the courtyard, heart pounding. She reached the gate just as Robb's horse clattered in. He sagged forward, nearly toppling off. She and another man grabbed him, easing him from the saddle. His face was ashen, sweat beading on his brow. She feared another wound, but the maester rushed up, and after a quick inspection, he shook his head. "It's the old wound reopened, my lady. The strain tore some stitches. He's lost blood. Quickly, help me carry him." Brienne dismounted, swaying on her feet, her own shoulder soaked in fresh blood that seeped through her armor's straps. Her eyes scanned the courtyard anxiously until she spotted Robb in Catelyn's arms. "He lives." "Yes," Catelyn said breathlessly. "You're hurt yourself." Brienne grimaced. "I'll tend to it once he is cared for." She kept a hand near her sword hilt, as though expecting more frays to burst in after them. But the portcullis slammed down, the drawbridge lifted. The few men who had followed Robb out quickly poured back in, many wounded or winded. Cheers and cries mingled with pained groans. The courtyard stank of sweat, blood, and scorched leather. Yet, from the walls, men shouted that the Freys were not pressing a major counterattack. Plumes of smoke still rose from the catapult and a nearby supply pavilion. They had inflicted damage on the siege lines. For the moment, at least, Riverrun had struck a blow. Catelyn helped the maester carry Robb to the infirmary, her heart hammering with both relief and terror. She glimpsed the battered survivors limping to the hall behind her. The cost had been high, several men had fallen, and more were grievously hurt. But they had destroyed or damaged some of the enemy's machines, set a portion of their camp aflame, and hopefully disrupted the Frey's unity. It was a small victory in a war that seemed impossible to win. Yet it was a victory nonetheless. As the maester fussed over Robb, Catelyn stood by, trembling with a swirl of emotions. She recalled the grim vow she had made in those early days after the Red Wedding. The realm might still conspire against them, and the Freys and Boltons might have endless resources, but so long as the king in the north lived, hope endured. They had allies beyond these walls, men who remembered their oaths and despised Walder Frey's treachery. Perhaps, with cunning and courage, they might yet turn the tide. Even as worry gnawed at her for Edmure's fate, for Talisa's unknown whereabouts, for her daughters lost or captive, she felt a spark of fierce pride. Robb Stark had ridden out to face his enemies, defying the doom that had nearly claimed him at the Twins. The Red Wedding had not broken the North spirit. It had only hardened their resolve. Night fell, and Riverrun's defenders manned the walls in wary anticipation of a retaliatory strike. But none came that night, save for a desultory exchange of arrows that fizzled out after an hour. Word trickled back that the Fry camp was in disarray, with destroyed supplies and scattered men who had panicked during the raid. Catelyn lingered in the courtyard, speaking softly to the returning knights and praising their bravery. Many had lost friends or suffered wounds themselves. Still, there was a grim sense of accomplishment in their eyes. They had shown the Freys that the wolf and fish could still bite. When she returned to Robb's bedside, the maester had finished restitching his shoulder. Robb lay propped against a pillow, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Brienne stood nearby, her own wounds bandaged. They both looked battered, as though they had aged a decade in a single night. Catelyn lowered herself onto a stool, letting out a shaky breath. She wanted to scold Robb for taking such a risk, but the relief that he still breathed overcame all else. He opened his eyes when he sensed her presence. "Mother," he said, voice raspy. "Did we do it?" She touched his hand gently, mindful not to jostle him. Yes, you burned their catapult, scattered their lines. It was a victory, Robb. His lips curved in a faint smile. Then it's a start, he murmured, and slipped into a weary sleep. Catelyn watched him, feeling an odd peace settle over her despite the perils that still lay outside these walls. The war was far from over, but the Red Wedding's intended finality had been averted. They would fight on. Brienne, silent and watchful, caught Catelyn's gaze and gave a single nod of shared understanding. So long as they drew breath, the Freys and Boltons would find the price of their betrayal steeper than they ever imagined. Outside, the fires still glowed in the Frey camp, faint and sullen. But from within Riverrun's ancient stones, a new determination shone, one that no mere siege engines could extinguish. And in the quiet hush of the infirmary, Catelyn Stark bent her head over her wounded son, her heart unyielding and her spirit set upon vengeance and survival alike. The dark had fallen, but the dawn would come. They had survived the Red Wedding itself. They would survive whatever storms Walder Frey conjured next. In that resolve, she found the strength to keep breathing, to keep planning, and to keep fighting for the day when House Stark and House Tully would stand triumphant once more.